One of the stories was about a miracle he had once performed in Skanda Ashram, when his mother one day, leaving him inside a room in deep samadhi, bolted him in from outside and went to the town, and on her return, to her great surprise, found him seated under a tree in the garden outside, and the door still bolted, as she had left it. She was so impressed by this miracle that she told it to everyone she met. The truth was, Bhagavan said, that he had unbolted the two door shutters from inside and then rebolted them, as before, from outside, from sheer habit. Again and again the Master spoke of his early life in the big Arunachalaswara temple in the first year of his escape to Tiruvannamalai in 1896. Whilst urchins troubled him, educated adults had much respect for him, although he was then still in his teens. Pious men used to seek his company almost daily on the steps of Subramania's shrine. Two lawyers in particular were assiduous in this respect. On a certain Hindu festival day, they prepared a grand dinner and came to take it to him, but his immovable silence indicated his refusal of their invitation. There was no alternative for them but to use force, which they did by joining hands and bodily lifting him till he agreed to walk with them. Bhagavan said that that was the only house in Tiruvannamalai where he ate once. Another time he was also bodily carried and bundled into a waiting cart and fed, but that was not in a private house, but in the Ishanya Muth, an ashram-like institution for sannyasins of a special caste in the northern end of the town. Then there came a break in my life at Tiruvannamalai. By the end of 1938, I felt I must go away for a while, as the next chapter will narrate, not to part company with my sadhana, but on the contrary, to prevent it from degenerating into a colorless, monotonous routine, which I feared might wreck or dry up the perennial inspirations which are necessary for continued efforts. So I planned a leisurely tour in South India. I visited temples and stayed in holy places for long or short durations, as the spiritual moods took me. Everywhere I was well received. No temple closed its doors in my face, anywhere, as it was done to non-Hindus. Wherever I went, Bhagavan's name acted like a charm, particularly as I had adopted the Indian dress from the beginning of 1936, lived in Brahmin streets, and ate Brahmin food, which was pure vegetarian. I even for the time discarded the wearing of footwear, bathed in Hindu bathing tanks, and attended evening temple worship with the smearing of ashes on my arms and forehead. This proved of much benefit at that stage of my sadhana. In the end of 1939, I found myself landed in Anandashram in Kanhaghat, on the North Kerala coast, of which Swami Ramdas was the presiding deity. I had planned to stay there for a few weeks, but somehow I lingered for more than 8 months. Anandashram is very beautifully situated. To the east stretches a small range of sloping hillocks, almost evergreen from the torrential rains that fall there in both the monsoon seasons. To the west, a plain gently slopes for almost 4 miles down to the sea, across fields sparsely strewn with villagers' huts, coconut groves, and tobacco plantations, in between which is wedged a thin strip of the township, which is very much smaller than Tiruvannamalai. Being far from the public road, the ashram, Anandashram, enjoys a natural, quiet, and sweet, idyllic simplicity, which made it a congenial retreat at that time for me. So I liked the place and stayed on, and did my work in my own way. Even the peculiar atmosphere of this ashram suited me in my then moods. After a short while, I began to distinguish the psychical difference between it and Ramanashram. I was greatly amused when I detected the way Ram Dass was affecting me. It enhanced the boyish tendencies which had been at times causing me much inconvenience, and which I had been trying to curb: the loquacity, the hastiness in action, the quickness of temper, the extreme sensitiveness to sound, the bouts of paralyzing shyness. I had spent 15 years since 1925 in comparative loneliness and silence, but Anandashram drew me out to the spontaneity of my adolescence for a good part of the time I was there. For in Ram Dass's presence, the heart expanded with joy, reminiscent of Krishna's Leela in Vrindavan. Joy permeated everything: the hills, the grazing cattle, the faces round one, and the very air one breathed. All were joy-inspiring. All Ram Dass's Ram. In the spiritual life of some devotees, what counts most is genuine bhakti, irrespective of labels and nomenclature, and Anandashram was no doubt surcharged with it, but it was a bhakti which was nurtured by joy. Joy and love oozed out of every pore of Ram Dass's being and infected his neighborhood. When I returned to Ramanashram in July 1940, the Second World War had already broken out, and darkness had fallen on the hearts and minds of men. Bombs had dropped on Warsaw like rain. Poland and Czechoslovakia had been subdued. Many millions of innocent men, women, and children had been driven to concentration camps for a dreaded purpose. The Maginot Line had cracked and crumbled, and Paris had fallen to the mighty army of the invader. I had expected to see some marks of this widespread devastation on the life of Ramanashram, but on arrival I found none whatsoever, except, to my surprise, a doubled rate of flow of devotees. The only other physical change I observed was in the master's body, which started showing signs of age, which had compelled the management to curtail the attendance hours at night. At midday, the doors of the hall were closed for 2 hours for his siesta, the first time in the history of the ashram. At first, Bhagavan demurred, but soon he grew resigned to the situation, seeing that it had some justification. The stream of visitors continued to increase, so that soon afterwards, sitting accommodation and easy access to the master on personal matters became more difficult. In fact, under the new rules, letters and articles written by devotees were made first to pass the censorship of the office before they could be shown to him, which was not without reasons. 1 or 2 devotees, taking advantage of the master's compassionate nature, took to write to him letters running to several pages in very small hand on petty, often imaginary difficulties in their spiritual practice, on which he strained his eyes for 1 or 2 hours. He was too scrupulous to let a single word go unread, which encouraged them to write still longer letters, and daily too, imagining their epistles to be of great interest to Bhagavan, till the management found it imperative to clamp down a ban on all correspondence to be shown or written to Bhagavan. A year or 2 later, a colony of devotees, with families for the most part, sprang up around the ashram. As Bhagavan's body grew weaker, his power to influence and attract increased, so that the tide of settlers and visitors continued steadily to rise and included world-famed philosophers, scholars, politicians and ministers, provincial governors and generals, foreign diplomats, and members of foreign missions. They all came, whether in war or peace, in rain or shine. The tide swelled and reached its zenith in 1950, the last year of his earthly life. To the last, the Master continued to instruct. In the whole history of the ashram, there has never been a bar to the seeking of spiritual guidance orally from him, except in the very last year when he was seriously laid up and the visitors of their own accord desisted from troubling him. As time passed and the Master's state of mind and ideas took firm root in me, I ceased to ask questions or to intercept him in his walks outside the ashram grounds as I used to do in the first 6 months of what I called my vanaprastha life. For by then, all my spiritual questions, call them problems if you like, had resolved themselves in various ways. The final conclusion to which I came in the end of these 6 months, I reported one day to Bhagavan. He showed his gracious approval by a gesture of finality with his hand and said, "So much lies in your power. The rest must be left entirely to the Guru, who is the ocean of grace and mercy, seated in the heart as the seeker's own self."